So, just in case you don't already know what's going on, although given the people who are in the chat, you probably were there for my last stream, we are making a World War II tier list. So, we have all these different countries here, and then we are going to be ranking them in terms of how well they performed during the war, going from well, S tier, so that's the best, to F tier, that's the worst, and then we also have some irrelevant. So it's basically going to be the same structure as World War One. And what we're going to do is we're going to place countries, but we're first going to ask the audience where they think the country should be, and then I'm going to put the country somewhere and explain my reasoning for it. Let's start off with, of course, the elephant in the room, which is, I think we're just going to keep this here, which is Germany. All right, so where I put Germany is probably going to surprise you. I am putting Germany in S tier. So, why am I putting Germany in S tier? I know it sounds surprising, right? Because Germany lost the war and they got completely defeated. So then why even bother putting them S tier or A tier, let alone S tier? Well, the reason that I put Germany in S tier is because when you think about how they performed given their position, it really is insane. Like it's very hard to find I'm being called a wereaboo. I'm not one of these like Germany is great. I know it might sound like that based on where I put Germany in both of these tier lists, but I'll explain why I put Germany so high. Remember, we got to think about the position Germany's in. Germany is a country smack in the middle of Europe, fighting literally I think the three largest countries on earth. You have Soviet Union, which is like the largest continuous country in the world, also has like over 100 million people. You have the US, which is largest economy and probably largest military on earth too. And then you have the United Kingdom, which was the largest country on earth. Not to mention they're also fighting France, which was enormous back then. And then of course other countries in Europe. But when you think about the fact that these, you know, this country, why I hate that this thing's here. Sorry, but when you think about the fact that this country was fighting four of the superpowers, managed to completely knock out one, got close to defeating another one, and did decently well against another one, I have to say that's pretty impressive. And especially given that they had no good allies. Like when you think about it, right? I mean, like, I'm not saying where I'm going to put Italy, but you can imagine, right? Italy's not going to be A or B tier. Like, we know that, right? Italy did terrible. Um, and then, sure, they had Japan. Japan was a great ally. Well, great militarily, but not a good ally because the Japanese couldn't do anything to help the Germans. The Germans were essentially alone, right? Okay, they take over Poland. That's not that impressive because they're also doing the Soviet Union. But then, they take over the Benelux and France in like a month period, right? France, a country that had produced Napoleon, just a little over a century ago, which was doing so well, completely crushed France. Also took over Denmark in like 6 hours, took over Norway pretty quickly, um, nearly destroyed the British at Dunkirk as well, and then invaded the Soviet Union and actually got pretty close to defeating the Soviet Union. And all of this with no substantial military or financial help, while the, allies combined, which control probably 60, 70% of the earth, had such a hard time. It took them 6 years to defeat this basically one country. That, in my opinion, already is remarkable enough. And then when you look at the ratio of how many German battles were won as compared to lost, obviously Germany lost more battles than it won. That's clear. But it's not that close, or it's like the difference is not that big between the amount of German victories and the amount of German losses. So the Germans, I think they lost about half their battles, decent amount were inconclusive, somewhere around 35% to 40% won. And so it's a very good ratio. And so I think given the situation that they were in, and given the fact that also all these countries they're occupying hated them, I have to give Germany S tier because I really don't think any other country could pull that off. And yes, even the US, I don't think the US, if you put it in the same position as Germany was in, that they could have pulled off the same thing. So Germany is in S tier. Yes. So this is Slovakia. Now, obviously, I'm not going to talk about Slovakia much because one, that's boring. Two, they didn't contribute much to the war. Um, and Slovakia just isn't that interesting of a country. Like no one thinks about, oh yeah, the Slovaks in the war. Um, but yeah, Slovakia, they invaded Poland and they did okay. But then the rest of the war, they kind of sucked. So I think we're gonna put Slovakia D tier. Didn't really do that great. Yeah. All right, yo, this is the one that I think we'll all find interesting. Italy. We are putting Italy F tier. Italy did awful, and I don't think anyone can, dispute that. Right? Italy is a country that already from the very start of the war performed horribly. So basically, Italy enters the war because Germany is taking over France so fast they want to get in on the action. Italy invades France, and even though France is literally collapsing to Germany, they have all their troops fighting the Germans. The Italians are so bad they're losing to the French. Think about how pathetic that is when your country, when you're allied with the most powerful military in the world, and yet your country can't even invade France in World War II. Then, as if that was not bad enough, Italy invades Greece and does so badly that the Greeks invade Italy back. Now, what do I mean? They didn't invade modern day Italy, they invaded Albania, which is part of Italy at the time. So they're failing against the French. The Germans had to help them there. They're failing against the Greeks. The Germans had to help them there. And in fact, the reason that Germany invaded Greece is because Italy was so bad during that war that they had to come in and help invade Greece for them. And then, sure, the Italians got some spoils in Yugoslavia, but obviously they contributed nothing to it. Later on, you get North Africa. The only reason the North African front was relevant at all is because the Germans came to reinforce the Italians, because otherwise the Italians would have been wiped out in North Africa even more quickly. The Italians obviously lost in East Africa too. Their navy, despite being enormous, performed pretty terribly. I mean, they couldn't invade Malta for one thing. And so then you get to the invasion of Italy itself. The Allies take the south, and then Italy switches sides and then fights the Germans. And actually, most Italian victories in the war come from that time when they're fighting with the Allies instead of with the Germans. So Italy, overall, just horrible. For a so-called great power, the fact that they achieved almost nothing really says a lot about how bad these people were at fighting the war. So yeah, we're putting Italy F tier. Tell me, guys, what you think in the chat about where I put Italy. Do you think I was too harsh on them? And then we will talk about this next country here. Yes, someone got the correct. That's Vichy France. Now, of course, I don't blame you guys for thinking this is regular France, but actually, regular France is going to be this one over here. So the one with the little cross thing, just because that was symbol of French resistance, and the Vichy French, at least their official flag was just the normal French flag. So this is actually not going to be France. This is Vichy France. I don't know too much about Vichy France. I am going to put Vichy France in F tier. Now, why am I putting Vichy France in F tier? The reason why is because Vichy France performed abysmally during this war. So Vichy France, in case you don't already know, after the Germans took over France, they established a puppet government in the south of France known as Vichy France. And Vichy France, first of all, it failed because it couldn't even take over all of the former French possessions. So yes, they took over southern France, and they had some of the colonies, especially West Africa, but like Central Africa was not under their control. Vichy France started off pretty terribly. The British came in to destroy their navy. Uh, they lost Indochina to the Japanese, even though the Japanese were allied with the Germans, so technically they're on the same side. It's kind of weird what was going on back then. And then when it comes to the actual battles that Vichy France won, they're so few as compared to the amount of battles the Vichy French lost, mostly to the British and the Free French, that the Vichy French essentially did absolutely nothing for the Germans. They were a complete liability, and eventually they got dissolved for all practical purposes in 1942, just because the Vichy French sucked. So we're putting them in F tier. So Any thoughts on what I just said about Vichy France? Otherwise, next country over here is Hungary. So I'm going to be doing a compromise. I am putting Hungary in D tier. Now, Hungary didn't do that much during the war. They weren't really a German puppet state. They're allied with the Germans, but essentially the Hungarians did pretty badly. They lost most of their battles. They didn't contribute much to the war, and by the end, they were completely dependent on the Germans. While Miklos Horthy, the leader, was not a bad leader, I would say. He seems to have been okay. Um, Overall, though, yeah, the Hungarians performed pretty terribly. And so I see them the same way as Slovakia. Weak German allies who contributed very little. So they're D tier. Yeah, so I would say Bulgaria, they did very well in World War One, as um, as I showed in the World War One tier list. But World War Two, the Bulgarians essentially did nothing. So we are putting them irrelevant tier. All right, now Romania. All right, so Romania is a bit tricky for me. Um, I'm gonna put Romania though in A tier. So I know that seems pretty high, but I'll explain why Romania is so high up. Romania, when you look at how many battles they won, it's actually pretty impressive. And they were the only country in the Eastern Front, I think, that actually contributed something to the German war effort. As in, most of these other allies essentially did nothing. Italy, Slovakia, Hungary, whatever. These countries didn't contribute much, but Romania actually did a lot. And considering that Romania is by no means a powerful country, and the powerful military, and is pretty irrelevant geopolitically. The fact that they did pretty well against Soviets actually says a lot, so I'm putting them in A tier. All right, next, guys. Next, we have Croatia. So, Croatia, no one seems to care, and you're correct. Croatia basically did nothing during the war. We're putting them in irrelevant as well. All right, next here, this is Iraq. Looks like no one cares about Iraq. That makes sense. Iraq kind of did nothing. Iraq is going to be put in irrelevant tier. Okay, next we have Thailand. Thailand, we're putting in irrelevant tier. Thailand did do a little bit in the war, but essentially Thailand didn't change much. But I think technically they were Japan's main ally in the war, which is kind of interesting. So, yeah, we're putting Thailand in the irrelevant tier. And now, guys, I do want your opinion on this. We have Japan. And Japan is quite interesting, right? Regardless of where, I feel like Japan's not as straightforward. I am going to put Japan in B tier. So here's the reason why I put Japan in B tier. So on the surface, right, it seems like Japan and Germany are pretty similar situations. They're small countries, but are very heavily industrialized and militarized. They burst onto the scene, take over insane amounts of land very, very quickly, and then just as quickly they got destroyed. So in that case, why am I not putting Germany and Japan at the same level? Well, here's the reason why. As I mentioned with Germany, Germany was facing the Soviet Union, which was enormous, France, which was enormous, UK, which was enormous, US, which is enormous. And three of these literally basically border Germany. On the other hand, the Soviets were scared of intervening against Japan. The British basically got whooped there. And so the British weren't really a major threat to the Japanese. Like actually, the Australians were probably the major Anglo country fighting Japan. The French, as we said, they lost Indochina very quickly and almost without a fight. And so you only had America to deal with. And America was across the Pacific Ocean, which is the largest ocean in the world, right? Like at least you could say with D-Day, right? The US already was landing troops in Britain. And so therefore, they were very close. But the US, they didn't really have much of an advantage. They had the Philippines. The Philippines were easily taken over. So the US basically had to start from Hawaii and, kind of from Australia too. But Japan was only fighting one enemy. Japan had all this water to defend themselves that the Germans didn't really have. And, you could say, oh, Japan didn't have great allies. Germans didn't have any either. And I would say, actually, The German allies were holding them back, or the Japanese didn't really have these allies holding them back. And also in terms of the amounts of battles the Japanese lost, it was decently higher than the Germans. Like I think they lost two-thirds of the battles. And then in the end they got nuked. So because of that, I don't think we can compare German and Japanese performance during the war. Because even though superficially it kind of looks very similar, the Japanese, I would say, didn't really have it as hard as the Germans did. Because you got to keep in mind, even America, Japan's only main enemy, was also fighting the Germans too, right? So they were split. The Japanese could focus basically completely on America. Well, and they had China too, but they couldn't really, they barely advanced in China either. So Japan's B, they did well. Like, don't get me wrong. For a country their size, they did well, but not insanely well. All right, guys, next we have Finland. I think all of us, yeah, okay, all of us agree Finland's S tier. So yes, Finland, S tier. I would say this. I think Finland was the best performing country in the entire war. They won most of their battles. They fought an enormous country and basically won, like they lost very little. They had no real major help either from the Germans or the Western allies, especially at first. Um, they weren't even that vindictive, as in they didn't really destroy Leningrad in the same way the Germans were. And I would just say the Finns basically, in terms of the position that they were put in, I would say they acted pretty morally. Like, yes, they fought the Soviets, but that's the Soviets invaded them first. And then later on, they fought the Germans and they beat them as well. Um, and when you think about Finland, a tiny country, a mostly inhospitable country, one with not that many resources, and one that's not known at all for like being some military power, and especially one that's been dominated by its neighbors for its entire history, whether we're talking about the Soviets, the Swedes, the Russians, whatever. For such a small and inexperienced country to do so well, Finland, I would say, by far best performing country of the entire war. So yes, we are putting Finland in S tier. All right. So I know the Finns are not exactly Axis because they sort of switch and they were never really Axis, but for simplicity's sake, this is the end of the Axis, and now we are going to be talking about the Allies. So the first question is Poland, of course. We are putting Poland in C tier. Why is that the case? Now, obviously, Poland got completely destroyed at the start of the war. And that in itself, while I understand they were against hard circumstances, does mean that we can't put them in like A or S tier, right? Because obviously, right, a country that gets overrun and occupied for the entire war cannot be so high. Now, we do have to keep in mind they were being invaded by both Germany and the Soviet Union. And so they were against one of the largest countries in the world combined with one of the best militaries in the world. And so because of that, I think it would also be unfair to put them in like F tier or something or D tier, right? Because they were fighting almost all alone against two major powers, right? So it would have been hard for any country to survive that. The Poles also fought quite well on many fronts. I mean, they were fighting in Italy. I think they were fighting in North Africa too. I mean, they fought all over, and they won a decent amount of battles. But in the end, right, Poland still collapsed, and so that's why they're put in C tier, right? We can't say they performed well, but obviously they didn't perform terribly either. All right, next we have France. So yes, you will see there is this thing for Free France, but for France, I'm including both France before 1940, before May 1940, plus Free France. So when I refer to France, I'm talking to Free France plus France. We are putting France in C tier. So why? Well, obviously, right, everyone knows the meme about France totally failing in World War II. And I mean, we can't cut them slack on this because, now we have these revisionist histories and they're all like, oh, France actually was so good, but like their leaders sucked. It's like, okay, part of the military is the leadership. If the leadership suck, you can't be saying, oh, well, the soldiers themselves were really good, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, no, like this is a country, again, just a little over 100 years ago, was taking over almost all of Europe. This is a country that lost to Prussia in 1870, barely won against Germany in 1914, and completely collapsed. Like literally completely collapsed in 1940. For a country of the size, importance, and wealth of France, and specifically because they had so-called the best army in the world in 1939. The fact that they got beaten so badly by Germany says a lot about France and how awfully they did during the war. I mean, France held out as long as Norway, right? Norway, which is not has never been a strong military power. So we're not going to cut France slack on 1940. Like we're not forgetting that. But at the same time, after 1940, though, the Free French really performed well. Now I'm not talking about like the French resistance or whatever, which is super overhyped. French resistance, I think, basically did nothing. But the Free French, especially in Africa, fighting against Vichy France, fighting in North Africa, fighting in D-Day, not exactly D-Day, but during the liberation of France, fighting in Italy, the Free French did pretty well. And so I basically see France and Poland as the same thing. They did awfully at the start, but then I would say recovered. And so that's why I didn't put either of them in D tier. Unsurprisingly, we are putting UK in A tier. So why is that the case? Well, obviously, some things don't really need to be said. The UK for a long time was basically the only major country holding out against Germany, and especially in odds that no normal country really should have persisted in combating, right? When you think about it, the Germans controlled Germany, France, Benelux, Denmark, Norway, um, allied with Italy, and also took over parts of Poland. Why were the British even bothering to fight when they were fighting such a formidable enemy? And yet they continued. And that in itself has to be mentioned because, right, most normal countries would realize from a strategic point of view, it's pretty useless to fight, that country alone. But yet the British kept doing that. And so I have to say, like, that is probably the biggest reason I put them in A tier because I would say from a military perspective, they did decently well, but militarily alone, I put them B. I honestly think that if Britain wasn't an island, they probably would have gone overrun. Maybe not as badly as France, but they would have not, done so well. Like Britain's main advantage was just being an island. And so if they weren't an island, I don't think they would have done that well. And so that's why I haven't put them in S tier because I just think that really the geography is the main thing that saved the British. But that said, though, the fact that they continued and didn't sign peace does say a lot. And I think that brings them up from B to A tier. Now, in terms of percentage of battles won, basically Britain won about 2/3 and lost a third of their battles. Um, and I will have to say, researching this video, I did really realize how much the British fought. Like the British fought more battles than any of the allies, even the US. And they fought everywhere. The British were fighting the Atlantic. They were fighting in the Mediterranean. They were fighting in North Africa. They were fighting in Western Europe. They were fighting in Italy. They were fighting in Malaya. They were fighting in Indonesia. They were fighting in Burma. And so, for a country that, especially at this point, was no longer the world's most powerful country, to be willing to fight everywhere, plus the resistance, I think that cancels out sort of the geographic advantage that kind of just say Britain, or the fact that they lost a decent amount of their battles. So that is why I'm putting Britain in A tier. Yeah. So that's my thoughts on Britain. Australia, I feel like, is in a very similar situation to Britain, except that instead of Germany, they're facing Japan. So basically, right, Japan overtakes the entire neighborhood, so to say, and the Australians are basically left by themselves, right? The British have had their butts kicked. The Dutch have basically collapsed. The Americans have been kicked out of the Philippines, and so they need to regroup. The Chinese are barely holding out, and so because of that, right, Australians kind of are left on their own. Now they do have American help, right? But in terms of the Americans, for the time being, at least started in 1942, wouldn't have been able to send their troops directly to Australia yet. So the Australians are kind of holding out by themselves. And I will say the difference is obviously the Australians kind of were not leading in the leading position, so to say, but Australians were fighting everywhere. The Australians fought in Greece, they fought in North Africa, A lot of Australians actually North Africa. There I think maybe even a couple were in Western Europe, although don't quote me on that, I don't remember. But I think the Australians' main contribution was just when it came to the Pacific War, right? Specifically the Solomon's campaign and other stuff like that. The Australians contributed a lot alongside the Americans. And the Australians also won a similar ratio, like almost the same, about two-thirds victories, one-thirds loss. And so I have to say, given the situation the Australians were in, they performed quite well. And so I'm going to put them in A tier. All right, next we have New Zealand. Well, we are going to also put New Zealand in A tier. So, why is New Zealand A tier? Well, New Zealand and Australia basically have almost the same story. The Australians and New Zealanders basically fought together. They were kind of on the same fronts, fighting the same areas, mostly in the Pacific. Um, yeah, I'm just not saying more just because Australia and New Zealand are kind of the same in terms of their contribution and all that. And of course, New Zealand was smaller, but it's a very small country. So yeah, New Zealand is A tier as well. Okay, next, South Africa. I'm sure people probably know even less about South Africa than New Zealand. We are going to put South Africa in A tier as well. Now, again, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, like, it's kind of all the same stuff. I mean, these basically were all there to help the British. So, fighting in North Africa. South Africans, I don't think were fighting in Asia necessarily, but they were helping out in France, they were helping out in Italy, helping out in North Africa. And in terms of, once again, the ratio, again, very similar, about two-thirds victory, one-third loss, or maybe stalemate. So yeah, South Africa is also going to A tier. All right, next, and just because I am biased, I want to hear your guys' opinion, but I think they also contributed a decent amount. Where do you guys think Canada should be placed on this tier list here? Canada, we are putting them in A tier. Now, I was surprised doing the research for the video just how much the Canadians contributed. Now, of course, probably Canada's main contribution to the war is D-Day, but Canada really did a lot. And especially, I'd say, unlike maybe the other three sort of British dominions that we have here, Canadians kind of acted more independently. The Canadians, first of all, they performed really well in places like Italy, and they did really well in France. They kind of single-handedly liberated the Netherlands as well. Um, I think some may have fought in North Africa too. I'm pretty sure some fought in North Africa. There wasn't much Canadian action in the Pacific, but there was a little bit of that. Actually, Canada's main losses, honestly, just mainly came from the naval battles, as in like Canada lost a decent amount of battles in the Atlantic. But that said, though, Canada actually had the third largest navy in the entire world after, like, by the end of the war, just after the United Kingdom and the United States. And so I would say that's pretty impressive. And as a Canadian, I can't say, and I'm not even trying to be biased here, but we did pretty well. We did pretty well. All right, guys, next we have Norway. We are going to put Norway in B tier. So why is Norway in B tier? Well, because as I sort of alluded to while talking about France, Norway and France fell in the same amount of time, but the difference being that the Norwegians, right, they didn't really have any close by allies. Yeah, sure, the British and French helped a little bit, but their assistance was very token and they quickly evacuated. The Norwegians were a very small country, didn't necessarily have a great military, and yet they lasted the same amount as France, which again had the best army in the world, so to say, back in 1939. And also, the Norwegians actually had a pretty good ratio. I mean, they won about as many battles as they lost. And so, yeah, Norwegians, pretty solid, pretty solid. All right, next we have Denmark. Okay, I will say this, Denmark, they fell pretty quickly, and I don't completely blame them. It's a flat country fighting Germany, but Denmark fell in 6 hours. That's so bad. I would put Denmark in the F tier, except for the fact that they fought one battle, or no, three battles they lost. So we're just going to put them in irrelevant. But if we were to put them in a category, they would definitely be F. Like, I honestly think that only maybe Italy performed worse than Denmark during this war. All right, now we have Belgium. I am going to be putting Belgium in C tier, though. Of course, Belgium got overrun very quickly. They had the so-called the strongest fort in the world, which got captured in one day, which is pretty pathetic because it's like the strongest fort in the world. The fact that all the Germans had to do was just land from above and whoop, wow, strongest fort in the world just got captured. It's pretty pathetic in my opinion. But that said, though, for a country their size, for a country that was totally unprepared for war, they didn't do too badly. And in Africa, at least, the Belgians, they didn't actually fight that badly. So I kind of put them in, the same. I mean, the C tier is kind of all the same countries, right? Poland, France, Belgium all got overrun really quickly, but it's somewhat understandable. And at least they did fight decently well afterwards. All right, next we have Luxembourg. We're in Luxembourg as irrelevant. Luxembourg kind of did nothing. All right, Netherlands. Putting Netherlands in D. You might say, okay, why don't we put Netherlands, Belgium in the same category? Well, the reason why is because the Netherlands didn't just collapse in Europe, which is already kind of bad in itself. But the Netherlands did horribly against Japan too. I mean, they're fighting with the British, the Australians, and the Americans, and they all did horribly. In early 1942, losing the Dutch East Indies, and yeah, the Netherlands just lost a bunch of battles. So yeah, Netherlands is D tier. Yeah, so we are going to put Greece in B tier. Greece would be A tier, but of course they did lose and get completely overrun. And so we can't really put them in A tier for that reason. But given how they destroyed the Italians and they did pretty well against the Germans too, Greeks were, formidable opponents. So Greece is put in B tier. All right, next, guys, we have Yugoslavia. It's probably going to surprise you guys. I'm putting Yugoslavia in irrelevant tier. Now, you might say, why? Why I'd say F tier is because Yugoslavia fell like 10 seconds against the Germans. Oh, that's funny. So here's the thing. The Yugoslav partisans, they did very, very well, right? I would almost say, yeah, maybe they could put them in S tier. But in terms of the country of Yugoslavia itself, didn't really do anything. It got invaded, lost, and they did put up a good fight, but yeah, just not really enough information, I'd say, for Yugoslavia. All right, guys, next, and I really want your opinion on this one because I think this is one of the most important. This next one here, Soviet Union. I'm putting Soviets in C tier because even though they almost crumbled under Barbarossa, they did better in the East, managed to fight off. I actually agree with this man here. We are putting Soviet Union in C tier. Now, originally, when I researched the video, I wasn't expecting to be so low, but the Soviets really did it pretty awfully. If you think about it, right, the Soviets were only fighting on one front. The British were fighting on a bunch of fronts. The Americans literally were single-handedly dealing with Japan. Um, and so the Soviets only had one front to fight on. And they did pretty terribly for a good start of it. First of all, they're completely unprepared for Barbarossa. They got all this land taken very, very quickly, completely overrun. They had to sacrifice so many men that they lost more people in the war than anyone else because people are going to be, oh, it wasn't all human waste. That's true. But, the Soviets, if they were more capable, could have easily, not caused so many casualties on their sides. And, Stalingrad, of course, was an impressive victory, but it came at such a high cost. Same with Leningrad. And the Soviets didn't care at all about their people. Also, the Soviets basically lost as many battles as they won, which is kind of pathetic when you think about it. Like, the record is barely better than the Germans, even though the Germans were fighting the entire world. Um, as someone else pointed out, they basically lost Finland too, and all of this while being helped a tremendous amount by the British and Americans. Soviets are kind of overrated. They could have been a lot better. So yeah, we're putting them in C tier. All right. Anyone has any opinions on Panama and their contribution to the war? I think we know where this one's going. Yep, we're putting Panama in irrelevant. All right, guys, next. USA. I am putting USA in A tier. Oh, there we go. All right. Now I'm gonna have a lot to say about this because, well, the US contributed a lot to the war. So why did I put the US or A tier? Yeah, so why did I put um, US in A tier? Well, I think obviously all of us would agree that US doesn't belong in like C, D, F, or even B tier. The US contributed a lot to the war. Um, they fought in North Africa. No, I would not say they mattered as much as the British, but they fought a lot in North Africa. The US invaded Italy and was a major reason why Italy fell. The US also, of course, played a very big role in terms of, the invasion of France, and kind of all of that, all of what that entailed. And then, of course, the US basically single-handedly defeated Japan. Now, of course, the British and the Chinese and the Australians all played a major role. But I'd say the British did pretty awfully compared to what they should have been doing. The Chinese did pretty terribly too, and the Australians were the only kind of decent ones there. But so, given all that, why did I put the USA in A tier? Well, first of all, because the US had the same military record I found as pretty much all the Anglo nations in terms of the percentage of victories to losses was pretty much uniform among all the English speaking countries. And that's why all of them are in the same tier: UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And also just because the US does have that geography advantage. And so you can't really discount that either. I mean, like, it's kind of the same reason I didn't put the UK in S tier. Like, both of these countries were kind of just lucky to have the geography advantage, where the US didn't have to suffer from the war at all. They didn't have to deal with bombings. They didn't have to deal with their infrastructure being destroyed. They also had a massive population and, two entire oceans separating them. And so, the US was fighting a fairly comfortable war, I'd have to say, overall, compared to almost any other country. And so that's why I don't think I can necessarily put them in A tier. And also, just when you compare it to Germany, right? When Germany was doing all that they were doing while fighting the entire world, I don't think the US could have done the same thing, or even Finland, for example. And so that's why I put the USA in A tier. Although I would say out of the A tier, they're probably the highest ones. I do think, though, just the kind of the U.S. Geographical advantage, and also the fact that at the beginning of the war they didn't too well, especially the Philippines and stuff. There were some major L's for the Americans, but of course, Americans did bring the war to an end. And again, it's really, I think, Japan and the whole Pacific War where the U.S. really shine. They did a lot in Europe, but the Japanese, I think they contributed much more to defeating those guys. So yeah, we're putting USA in A tier. All right, guys. The last kind of major country, so to say, is China. So where are we gonna put China? Where are you gonna put China? China's, you know, very important country in the world. Okay, I need to stop. I need to stop this Donald Trump thing. Uh, I will say this. I'm gonna put China in C tier. Now, I was thinking maybe D tier or something, but in the end, the Chinese, you know, given how backwards they were doing decently well against the Japanese during the war. Now, of course, prior to the war, you could say 1937, 1938, they did pretty awfully. But the front lines were basically stagnant in China, and the whole reason the Pacific War happened and Japan got involved in World War II was precisely because they couldn't beat China. Also, the Chinese did get a lot of military aid, especially from the Americans and somewhat from the British, like in terms of supplies, but in terms of actual like combat, the Americans and British didn't do much to actually help the Chinese army. And so the Chinese were mostly left alone. And given that these guys had just gone through a civil war, warlord period, all that, the fact that they still managed to resist Japanese for that long, is pretty impressive. And especially when you think about their kind of victory to loss ratio, it's actually pretty good. But of course, China, again, it's kind of like France, like they kind of should have been doing better. So that's why they're C tier. Why aren't the Musinuri's partisans on this list? All right, guys. Obviously, these next five countries, they're not super relevant. I don't think people have any opinion on Mexico, so I'm just gonna put that in D tier, right? And same with Brazil, or not D tier, irrelevant. Although the Brazilians actually, they did some stuff, I will have to say. Brazilians actually fought somewhat, but yeah, not that much. They fought a bit in Italy, just so you know. Brazil B tier. Yeah, as you probably know, we're gonna put all these irrelevant. So the reason why is okay, Brazil and Ethiopia did a little bit, I do have to admit that, but for the most part, they didn't change the war much. I mean, Ethiopia never fought outside Africa and was mostly liberating its own land anyways. And Brazil, given how big their country is, they could have done more. So yeah, this is the final tier list. Right, we have Germany and Finland on top. Romania and the English nations is A. Japan, Norway, and Greece is B. Poland, France, Belgium, Soviets, and China in C. Netherlands, Slovakia, Hungary, D. Vichy France and Italy is F, and the rest is irrelevant. Then we are going to check the charts for the ratio of victories to losses because I think they're quite interesting. And just like we did in our World War One stream, we'll be doing that with this as well. Now we'll move on to these charts where we are going to see how much each country won and lost. There we go. So let's start off with Poland. So Poland, as we can see here, lost just a little over half their battles, right? So, that's kind of why we put them C tier, but they did win a good amount, right? Especially for someone fighting the Soviets and the Japanese. I should say a lot of these victories actually come from like fighting alongside the British. So if it was just the invasion of Poland, it would be a lot worse. But still pretty good ratio for a country like Poland. All right, then we have a couple of inconclusives here. Next, Soviet Union. See, this is what I mean, right? The victory and defeat ratio is very similar, despite the Soviet Union, right, being a major power. Despite having all this assistance, despite being so huge, they lost so many battles. So I don't find this particularly impressive. I mean, they couldn't even win half their battles. So Soviet Union, meh. See, why is it at the end we get all the viewers? Now we have 6 people in the chat. But yeah, if you're new in the chat, welcome. Please comments in the chat so I can know who you are. Now, guys, look at this. Look at this. Finland, 70% win ratio. That's crazy. And then even defeats less than 20%. We just have a lot of inconclusive. But yeah, Finland, you look at this. Yo, let's go. Only buy in the chat. Guys, this is a historic moment. We gotta screenshot this. All right, so now we get to Germany. Germany lost just a little over half their battles, but they won about 40%, which is pretty good, and a couple of inconclusive. But yeah, for a country facing such bad odds, right? I feel like Germany did pretty well. Okay, I find it odd though that Germany is an S when it lost, while the US and UK are A. Well, again, I don't really count the outcome too much, and I'm not trying to say the outcome doesn't matter, but the thing is, um, Germany, if it didn't have terrible allies and if it wasn't literally fighting everyone, they would have done pretty well, right? Because if you paired Germany individually against any of these countries, they probably would have won, right? But the problem with Germany is just they were fighting everyone at the same time. So I think that's the problem. Yeah, and PKW is already making my exact same points. I mean, yeah, so the US did contribute a lot to the Eastern Front. I just don't know how much, but as I said, they were probably the highest in the A tier. They're close to being S tier, but I put them in A at the end. Um, Germany would lose against the US, sure, but but I'm saying like German soldiers, the average German soldier was probably better than the average American soldier. Yeah. All right, next. Italy. Look how bad Italy is, guys. 60% loss. Only 31%. I mean, this is no big surprise, but yeah, Italy did terribly. Um, yeah. Hey, see, this is why I put Romania in A tier, because I'm sure some of you guys are asking why is Romania so high. Look at this. 60% win, less than a third of the time they got defeated. Have to say, props to Romania, Yes, because you see, PKW kind of agrees with me, right? Sure, like yeah, Germany and the US, if they were bordering the US would win, but you gotta keep in mind, right? I'm also trying to think that if there wasn't such a massive population disparity, and if there wasn't, um, such a large geographic disparity, I think the Germans would be doing better than the Americans militarily, right? So that's why I put Finland so high because sure, Finland lost. They lost against the Soviets. They didn't really take much land during the war, but given how small they were and how much of a fight they put up, that's why I put Finland in S tier, even above Germany. Um, all right, next, Hungary. See, this is why I put Hungary as so low. Where did I put Hungary? I think I put Hungary D tier. I mean, maybe I even should have put them F tier. I don't know. But Hungary, look at this. Hungary is so bad. Um, wow, I didn't realize that Germany only had 50 million less people than the US in 1939. Interesting. Yeah, so Hungary did awful, right? They suck. Look at this. This is even worse. Vichy France, 81%. 81% of the battles they fought they lost. Right? Vichy France has the worst military record out of all of these countries. Like this is why I put them in F tier. Like they're even worse than Italy, I would say. Right? Vichy France, terrible, terrible record right here. I like also how like everyone's debating the chat, like no one's even commenting on what I just said. But I'm not actually bothered by that because it's kind of good to see the audience engage with each other. Um, Next, Japan. So as we can see, right, Japan lost a lot of battles. And again, right, if it was not for the fact that Japan kind of was attacking so many countries and actually made a lot of progress, they would be lower. But again, right, this is the reason I can't put them in the same category as Germany, right? Japan just eh. All right, next we have China. You see, China has a good ratio. Maybe I should have put China B. I don't know, but then again, China, they should have been doing better. But yeah, China has a good ratio. 70% win. Uh, yeah, I like these pie charts, by the way. Thank you very much. Yeah, because I feel like these pie charts help you visualize things a lot better than if you just have a bunch of numbers or something, or you just look at a map because they don't always tell you everything, right? So China is 70% here. See, then you get the US here. And by the way, you'll notice like there's a very clear pattern with all the English speaking countries, right? So US 64% win, 30% loss, right? The US is doing pretty well, but this is why I also don't think I would necessarily put them in S tier. That is a lot of battles to be losing, especially for a country with so many advantages like the US. And then we get the UK, which is basically identical, right? 62%, so 2% less victories, a decent amount of more defeats, but still roughly similar. UK and US are pretty similar here. All right, and then we get to more Canada. Canada is pretty similar, but if you look actually at this, right? Canada only lost a quarter. And so in terms of the amounts of defeats Canada had, it's actually lower than any other English-speaking country. They had a lot of inconclusives. But in terms of winning, it's about the same, 64%. Australia, same thing. Um, oh, we got the American national anthem in the chat. Anyways, Australia, yeah, basically the same thing. Just a few more defeats. New Zealand did slightly worse than Australia. They lost a third of their battles, but still winning 60%. As you can see, though, all these English-speaking countries are all the same. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Again, South Africa looks almost identical to Australia. 64% win, 29% loss, right? So, yeah, kind of all the same here, UK, US, all these English. Okay, so now we get to France, right? France actually, they won more battles than they lost, which is sort of surprising. But you got to remember, this is including Free France, and most of these were against like Vichy France or something, which, as we've established, did awfully. But again, because of France's just overwhelming defeat in 1940, that's why they couldn't end up being higher. But pretty good ratio for France. Now we have the Netherlands. You see, this is why I put Netherlands lower than Belgium. This is Belgium, by the way. But Netherlands, right? It's like they're losing over half their battles. Yeah, pretty unimpressive. Belgium, Belgium's very equally split, right? And you have same amount of victories and losses, and then some inconclusives. Next, we got Norway. See, Norway, pretty good. As I said in the stream, right? Victory and defeats was almost the same amount. I think there's one more defeat than victory, with a few inconclusives. So yeah, pretty good for Norway. Um, I think we have a lot of people in the chat. We got how many? 5 people in the chat again. Let's go. See, Greece. This is what I'm saying though. Greece did really well, right? I mean, where did I put Greece in the end? Maybe I shouldn't even put Greece A tier. I don't know. But Greece, right, winning 69% of their victories, right? Actually, yeah, maybe I think we're gonna put Greece A tier actually in the end, um, because especially, but then they did get overrun, so yeah, maybe B tier after all, yeah. But still, Greece, right? These victories against the Italians, not all of them, not all of them. The Greeks also fought a lot with the British too, but still, yeah, Greeks did well. Slovakia, as I said, right at the very beginning, it's pretty bad chart. And yeah, and then that's it. And then the rest are kind of all irrelevant. So this is why these other countries I didn't really put them anywhere. Um, I don't know why I put Hungary. I don't think I even have a Hungary thing, so Hungary is a bit irrelevant. But they did pretty badly too, if I remember. Yeah, and then yeah, all these other countries: Bulgaria, Croatia, Iraq, Thailand, Denmark, Luxembourg, Yugoslavia, Panama, Mexico, Brazil, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia. They kind of all did nothing for the most part. Yeah. Oh, he's saying that these victories are against Italians, so they should be put in B tier. Okay, interesting. Yeah. All right. So now let's just look at some raw numbers because I also think these are interesting. Like the charts say something, they don't tell you how many battles these countries fought. So we're going to start off with Poland, right? Poland, as we can see here, right? Lost 50 battles, won 36, 8 inconclusive. So that's a decent amount of battles, right? Again, reason I didn't put Soviets that high. I mean, you look at this, they won 75, but they lost 64. That's a lot of battles to be losing. Finland, on the other hand, this is insane. 28 victories to just 7 losses. Really good. As I said, Poland, best performing country of the war. Germany. Now, Germany, this really shows you how involved Germany was. Germany lost 250 battles. 250. And yet they won 197. Almost 200 battles won. That is insane to think about. All these battles that the Germans were involved in. Then we got Italy, 47 wins and 90 losses, which is horrible. Very, very pathetic on Italy's part. As you can see, Romania, decent amount, but not that many battles. Oh yeah, this is why I put Hungary in D tier. 3 victories, 3 inconclusive, and 13 defeats. Yeah, Hungary, I mean, Hungary may even need to be in F tier, I don't know. But yeah, Hungary really did badly. Um, Vichy France, look at this, 22 defeats to 5 victories. Pretty awful. Now, again, Japan, 82 victories, which is pretty good. But then 182, so they lost 100 more battles than they won. And of course, most of these are to the US. So that's why I couldn't put Japan and Germany in the same tier because, Japan just didn't do that well. But still, not bad. China, as we can see, the ratio was good, but they didn't fight that many battles. They fought a total of 17 battles during the war. US is a lot. Look at this, 192 victories and 90 defeats. So the US, right, won over 100 more victories than defeats, which is very impressive, right? So props to the US, and there's a lot of battles to be fighting. Um, although we see that Germans fought more. But then we get to the UK, and this is why I have to say that the UK, I couldn't put it really a lower tier than the US. When you think about the UK and all that they had to go through, and they were still fighting more battles than the US, right? They won 221 victories and they lost 121, right? So just like the US, 100, I mean, in Britain's case, literally 100 more victories than defeats. In America's 102, right? But I feel like all the English speaking peoples, right, basically, and it makes sense from a historical and cultural point of view, they're all basically the same level of strength in terms of how good they are at war, which makes sense, because it's basically just English people in England as opposed to other countries, right? But um, the English, fight pretty well, but obviously I would not say they fight as well as the Germans do. So, yeah. Um, Yeah, resistance groups. I don't know. I feel like once you get into resistance, it kind of gets iffy. Oh, now we're down to 3. Okay, yikes. Canada, as you can see, Canada fought a decent amount of battles, 43 victories, 17 losses. Australia, though, I have to say, Australia kind of contributed more to the war in terms of fighting. 82 victories from Australia, which is a lot. That's a lot of victories. And then 38 defeats. New Zealand, not as much, but it makes sense. They're a small country. South Africa fought a lot fewer battles, 11 victories, 1 inconclusive, 6 defeats, right? So 17 battles in total. When you got to France, France actually didn't even fight that much compared to like Poland, for example. They had 44 victories, 25 defeats. Netherlands lost 25 battles and won 18. Yeah, not that great. Belgium, Same amount of defeats and victories. Norway actually fought a lot, 19 victories and 20 defeats. Greece, as I said, Greece is kind of goated. And then we got Slovakia. And then the rest I just didn't put in because they were kind of irrelevant. But yep, that is basically everything when it comes to this. Uh, Dang, we're down to what, 2 people now? Okay, well, anyways, for the 2 of you still here, thank you very much. Once again, here's a final look at the outcome of the tier list. And there you have it. If you're still here, I don't know, whatever concluding remarks, write those in. And of course, thank you all for showing up to the stream. I really appreciated it.